Well, we're delighted this week on Mixing It to welcome Jonny Greenwood and Colin Greenwood from Radiohead to talk about their recent album, Kid A, and also some of the inspirational pieces of music which gave rise to it. But first, I'd like to ask you both, since it's now 2 or 3 months since the album came out, how do you think it's been received, and did it all go according to plan?
It seems to have been received with a series of kicking, actually, in the press, to our not amusement, but sort of... I don't know, Colin should probably answer that.
Why? I think... sorry. But no, I didn't mean why should I bother to answer that question. I think we didn't give people enough time to listen to it as a record when it first came out. And I also think that, to be honest, it's the nature of the times that we're currently in. The guitar music that is successful now is kind of a sort of average standard, and the demographic that Radio 1, I heard the control on Radio 1 saying that the demographic is, I think, 14 or 15 to 25. So, I think we were kind of excluded by a lot of things, chance for the music to be heard, and I think, it was the right thing for us to do, to take a sidestep at a time when other artists have been releasing records over the past 2 months of considerable stature, to see their records drop out of the 10 and 20s and 30s like 2 weeks later.
I must say, I thought the reception was very interesting because, well, amplifying your point, I think there has been a tremendous dumbing down in what is called rock music over the last 5 years, really since Britpop. And the thing that struck me about all the reviews and a lot of the comments about this record was everyone was banging on about how incredibly difficult it was. And yet, it was an album, for the most part, of songs, recognisable Radiohead songs. Radiohead songs perhaps without the guitars, but this was spoken of as if it was like Metal Machine music by Lou Reed, just noise. And, it was, that to me was very illustrative of the kind of the diminished, really, sort of ambition of most rock music nowadays.
Yeah, and people who write about it. But then also, the other thing is a lot of people who are writing about us, they really like us. And people who really like you can be as dangerous as people who really hate you, because you can confound or disappoint their expectations. That I think a lot of writers expected us to come back and sort of save a certain kind of music genre from the pallid versions that had been put out a year later to much greater commercial success, and they expected us to come back with a sort of combination of OK Computer and the Bends, and sort of definitively stamp on all these sort of young six-string whippersnappers. And the fact that we sort of didn't do that, we sort of didn't, I think it's caused a lot of people to have to sort of, they've got their guitars out, they've had to put them back into the wardrobe.
I think we should hear some. Yeah. Let's hear the track National Anthem. That was National Anthem by Radiohead from Kid A. Now, there's a very unusual brass arrangement on that. Did you do that, Jonny?
Well, it started with Tom saying this track should really sound like, by the end, it should turn into a Charlie Mingus track. And Tom has these ideas quite often, and sometimes they're best ignored and sometimes they're genius, and he's completely right. And we pretty much just got a brass section into the room, and I scored out the rough tune, and Tom and I stood in front of them conducting, sort of. I say conducting, it wasn't Simon Rattle, it was more just jumping up and down when we wanted it to be louder and faster, and calming them down at certain points. I'm sure it looks ridiculous, but it sounded, it sounds on tape pretty good, I think.
It's a very spiky sound. Is that what you wanted?
It is, yeah. We wanted them to play around with the rhythms of what was happening and do cross beats and be taking in turns to take solos, really. A bit like Charlie Mingus, kind of the organised chaos of that. The fact that it's not random, there's a structure going on, but it's very loose around the edges, it's quite...
And the soloing seems to get more intense towards the end of the track. Were you trying to sort of build up the noise quota?
Yeah, well, the very last high note is actually done on the lowest instrument, so which gives you some idea of the sweat and the red faces going on in that room. It was intense.
Charlie Mingus, as a musician, obviously is tremendously diverse, extraordinarily prolific arranger and performer. Which bit of Mingus were you aiming for here?
I suppose like the blues and roots era. It's funny. I always find it very comforting to find that a whole style of music that I'd always been contemptuous of, like big band music, without knowing any, and just thought and never thought much of, and then someone played me Charlie Mingus, and I just thought, that's just fantastic, that's amazing. And so suddenly it opens up all this other music that you'd previously been contemptuous of. So that happens a lot to us.
So if you had to play a piece of Mingus, what would it be?
probably the opening track of Blues and Roots.
Wednesday Night Prayer Meeting by Charlie Mingus from his album Blues and Roots. This is rather an obvious question, Jonny, but you obviously, on every other Radiohead album, have played lots of guitars. On this album, you play very, very little. Was that a conscious choice, or did it just evolve out of the way the songs were sounding?
I think all of us, by turns, find the instruments that we're using frustrating and exciting and very easy to work with, and then very frustrating, whether it's a sampler or a guitar or anything. And these things tend to be most exciting and creative when you first come across them, in a way, when you first start using them. But there is something about the guitar that does keep me coming back to it. Yeah, there's more guitar on this record than people realise, in a way. It's just, it's more hidden than it previously was, I think.
That's what I thought when I read about the album before I heard it. I imagined there'd be no guitar, but I was surprised how much there was.
Yeah, and there's songs like Tree Fingers, which is just one guitar, but people just assume that it isn't.
And so presumably you're using the guitar through lots of effects processors or to trigger samples, so that actually what is triggered by a guitar doesn't necessarily sound like a guitar.
Yeah, that's pretty much how it happened. They just played lots and lots of guitar loops, and it was just creating wonderful texture. And Tom turned it into a structure rather than something aimless. That was all.
That's the song called Tree Fingers.
That's right.
It's quite Eno-ish, isn't it, in a way?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's very yeah, exactly. It'll break. It's quite speaker breaking as well. It has frequencies in it that can disturb the neighbours while still being very kind of slow and ambient, having no rhythm in it.
Tree Fingers from Radiohead's latest album, Kid A.
I wanted to ask you also about the vocal treatments, because maybe this comes back to what you're saying about being bored with the limitations of your instrument, or trying to find new sounds. So I was really struck by the way sometimes the vocals are very disguised. I mean, particularly on Kid A, there's sort of almost a sort of Stephen Hawking sound to the vocals. Was that something you were deliberately trying to do?
With regards to Tom, I suppose, I think he's obviously someone who he's very into the fine voice that he has. At the same time, he's always looking for new ways to try, and express different personae, and the way of doing that is by treating the voice, and I don't know which track.
Kid A was the one that really struck me,
where
it does all sorts of things.
Well, that was a vocoder whose notes he sang through a vocoder, and the notes were triggered by the on Martineau that you were playing at the same time as he was singing, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
It's pretty mad.
Was there a lot of trial and error in the making of this Kid A record?
No, I don't think it was quite that random. There's not a lot of things that we threw away or discounted. Is there, Colin? What do you think? There isn't loads and loads of tapes of versions or of music that we didn't like. I think some of it was quite slow, quite laborious.
Why?
Because I think as much what was going on in the studio is conditioned by what was happening outside, really. So I think, we sort of released a record when we finally decided we'd had enough of doing a record, or we wanted to sort of go outside again, really. So rather than, and the reason why it took so long is because we were also, at the time, quite damaged by the experience that we'd gone through with touring and promoting the last album.
What was it about that? I mean, this is a regularly heard complaint about people who achieved the level of global celebrity you did. What was it did you feel you were being damaged as music makers by that? And in what ways, if you were?
I think so. I think that's true, because, one of the big differences, when you're in a band, part of the deal is collaboration or working with other people, which is great. So, but you obviously have to get on with people relatively well, so that if you've gone through, say, a 7 or 8 year intensive touring, grueling period of, and your relationships aren't so strong within the group, then obviously, and you're spending money in a recording studio, it's not very, it doesn't help with the music, and the idea of spending 18 months on the road and then coming back and having to acquaint yourselves with recording skills after, and get into new music and seek new inspirations. And the last thing you want to do is turn on a CD player, so let alone turn on a multi-track tape machine. It's just rubbish.
Is that why this record sounds so different to the last one? Were you deliberately thinking we are going to really stretch ourselves and come up with some new sounds?
Yeah, I used to think that was true, but then whenever we start a recording session, it always does feel like the end of the previous one, even if that one was 2 years ago. It never feels like there's a cut-off point. I mean, as a band, we're no good at sitting around a table and planning our future, planning the next, even few days musically, and saying we should try and sound like this. We can't. We just, we're rubbish at it.
We had our sort of manifesto at the beginning of the last 3 weeks recording.
Exactly. We
each
tried
of us
it.
went round the table. Tom had his piece of paper, and each of us wrote down what musically we wanted to get out of the following 3 weeks. And it's just like looking back at that sheet of paper at the end of the month. It's like, oh no.
What did you put on your sheet of paper?
I was just trying to use the sort of live side of Phil's drums. One of the interesting things we did on tour this time was we took some of the songs from Kid A and we put them in a live context. And Jonny and Ed had these things called Chaos Pads, which are like really cheap DJ sample loop things. And so Tom would play the Rhodes and sing, and Jonny would cut up Tom's voice live and fire it into the audience, and Ed would cut up Tom's Rhodes keyboard and create all these amazing effects in real time and for everything in its right place in the first track. So try to get some of that into the sort of constant idea in the studio, change it live, take what you change back into the studio. It's sort of hybrid thing.
Now, you mentioned earlier on the Onde Martineau, you mentioned processing Tom's voice through that, but also, I mean, there is the Onde Martineau on this album, you can hear it, and it's an instrument that's associated with Messiaen, of course. Was he an influence on what you were doing?
When I was at school and was studying music, I just got very excited as a teenager to hear of this composer who was still alive and still writing music, and music that was so exciting and fascinating and mysterious and had all these sounds in. Partly I find it so wonderful because it's often just violins, it's often just standard instruments that are creating these wonderful new textures and sounds. So the Onde Martineau was something I just, that was my adolescent dream was to find one. I didn't even know what they looked like. I just knew, I used to read descriptions of them and one day dream of finding one and did, amazingly. So
where did you find one?
The grandson of Mr. Martineau invented the original one so I was getting all very Encyclopedia Britannica, but in 1928 it was first invented, and the grandson started to make them again, made a few, and managed to get hold of one, and it's a wonderful invention, great instrument.
So what's your desert island piece of Messiaen then?
Probably the first thing I heard, the Tarangalila Symphony, the first thing that fascinated me.
That was an excerpt from the Tarangalila Symphony by Messiaen.
Well, one piece that struck me having the Onde Martineau is How to Disappear Completely. There's a kind of very high line that moves above the song. Was it Martineau?
Yeah, I mean, that was, the string parts were written originally with an Onde Martineau, just multi-tracking it and playing one part at a time. And eventually we did replace it with real strings, but parts of it you can still hear the Martineaus going on.
It's quite a strange orchestration, because it seems to sort of like float over the top of the song in a kind of disembodied way.
Well, I mean, Jonny probably didn't have such a good time, but he scored the strings and played the Martineau live, didn't you, with the orchestra of St John's?
But I played it very, very badly out of tune.
St John Smith Square at Dorchester Abbey, and the Thames, and it was freezing winter. Was it February? And Nigel, our producer, took his Apple G3 and hard drive in and some microphones and no tape and recorded the orchestra and Jonny playing along on the Onde Martineau.
Decisions like that, which obviously are fairly radical, are they completely democratically agreed, or is there a certain amount of sort of banging the table and, no, we're going to do it this way, and you, for example, Jonny, insisting that be done? How much do you proceed by consensus and how much by insistence?
I don't think any of us are very good at table thumping. We seem to just stagger on in the lunacy. I mean, recording the strings was literally a case of setting up in the vestry of this church with one computer and just hoping it was going to work. It wasn't exactly wrapped in sellotape, but it was that sort of feeling. And especially doing strings when you've only got 3 hours and,
Had you demoed the string parts before? Did you know roughly what they were going to sound like?
No idea. And in the first playthrough, you're following the notes, just waiting for the wrong one to suddenly poke out, which it did a couple of times. And, but that was fun.
But they were wonderful. I mean, the
great
strings,
orchestra.
Yeah, great orchestra. And we wanted to. What was great about them was they sort of the antidote to sort of those ghastly London string sessions when. The people who are working on the music think it's all rubbish and they're off to do another rock band and they play Twinkle Twinkle Little Star between takes and John Lubbock, who's the leader of the orchestra at St John Smith Square, he was like wonderful, really, really, really helpful, and they're all really excited, and they all came back to our studio afterwards and drank loads of wine and listened back to it, and it was great. Because
we were told by the string players that the slang among string players when they go and do rock session in London, when the London musicians, is that it's known as doing balloons, which I didn't quite understand, but they explained that it's because all rock music is just lots and lots of minims, so it looks like a row of balloons, lots of long notes. So traditionally you turn up and you just say, "Oh God, more balloons, here we go." So it was nice to have the complete opposite with that with this orchestra.
How to Disappear from Kid A by Radiohead, and Colin and Jonny Greenwood of Radiohead are our guests tonight in this Mixing It extended special.
Let's talk about some of the other influences on the album. I gather Alice Coltrane, a piece by Alice Coltrane, was quite influential on one of the tracks.
Yeah, there's a series of records on the Impulse label that just all seem to feature lots of tambourine shaking and bell shaking and harps and people like Alice Coltrane and Pharaoh Saunders. That was, again, something we found only fairly recently. Wonderful textures to the records, very atmospheric recordings, which is a criticism some people often make of jazz, that the recordings can sound dry or can sound like there's a bit clinical, but her records have a depth to them that we try to emulate.
Blue Nile by Alice Coltrane, from an album which I will attempt to pronounce as Petard El Daoud. Has jazz been a recent interest of the band's, or has it always been there?
I'd say it's always been there, really. I mean, especially you, Jonny, as well. And Tom, I think everyone, really. Yeah, I mean, Jerry Mulligan Nightlights is one of my favourites. So.
I mean, the track that you were referring to, which maybe refers to Alice Coltrane, is Motion Picture Soundtrack, which has tons of harp glissandi all the way through it. What was the idea behind that?
Well, originally it was... Tom recorded the song by himself, just using this old harmonium, pedal organ, I suppose influenced by Tom Waits and that kind of singer-songwriter. And I just imagined it having harps and double basses. And so late one night, tried to do a version, trying to disguise the fact that we don't have any real harps. And we're cutting up all these samples and trying to make it all fit together. But I love the sound of harps. I mean, the atmosphere we're trying to get was one of also, how the Disney films from the 50s, where the colour fades slightly. And I think there was even one of the regular introductions that included the fairy spinning around.
Blue Jay. It was a Blue Jay.
Oh, was it a Blue Jay? And the sparks coming from behind.
Oh, yeah.
But the colours all a bit faded and watery. That was the kind of music as well we were trying to copy. Trying to be Bitches Brew by recording lots of electric pianos. And I mean, obviously none of us play trumpet and like jazz guitar very much. So, yeah, but so we can't really copy the music that closely. But atmospheres is something we try and copy. And there's parts of In a Silent Way that just have long chords and you no definite rhythm to them and not much movement.
Sounds like some of the criticisms of Kid A, doesn't it?
That was Miles Davis and his band with an extract of Shh Peaceful from the album In a Silent Way.
You must have noticed the fact that, it almost goes without saying, that the kinds of influences that we've been talking about, which you've acknowledged, are completely unknown to a lot of the people writing about the album. Do you think that matters?
I don't know. I think I was trying to explain to someone the other day that there are only 5 Pixies albums and we can't just carry on copying them. But that's how we started. And there's always we're gonna have to look for new music, and there isn't really enough guitar music to fill up our days. And some of it is still great. There's Serge Gainsbourg record we brought along that's guitar, bass and drums, and it's wonderful, and it's one of the best records actually
that's
made.
by Melody Nelson
as well.
Isn't it?
That's Melody Nelson, yeah.
How did you come across that?
I came across it through a friend. I think it was Decoy Records in Manchester, which is an excellent record shop, which is a friend of mine I was at college with who's working there. He sent me consignments of music. And what's great about it is it was recorded in London, I think, or using London session players. So it's that 60s London session players. And there was a studio, I think CRT, and also there's one near or under Marble Arch. And Gainsborough recorded it with these London players, and the strings and the sounds of these sort of blues jams and stuff. But it's a story. I mean, it's a very poetic. It's at times filthy and romantic and perverse and desolate of his infatuation with a woman who's, I think, how old is she? She's like 14 winters and 15 summers or something like that, you know. And she's she's Jane Birkin. So, but I mean, it's an incredible record, and it's like when we played, like our producer Nigel Godrich, who became obsessed with it as well, and you know, it's, because of the sound on it is amazing. So it's a wonderful record.
The late Serge Gainsbourg there with a track from his LP Melody Nelson.
Now, you mentioned In a Silent Way and Bitches Brew, and one of the way that they were recorded is they were live jams, and the records that we now know were actually pieced together in the editing.
Some of the musicians didn't even know Bitches Brew was being recorded.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Chick Corea, who I interviewed, I asked him about the Bitches Brew sessions, and he said that they didn't even know. They saw a red light was on, but they had no idea. They thought they were just sort of tuning up.
But the original tapes go on for hours. What we know as the albums are just very carefully edited by the producer. Was there an editing element in Kid A? You know, how were the songs actually put together?
I'm not sure we have the ability as a band to play for a great length of time and be inventive, you know. I mean, I am concerned that it sounds very smug when we mention all these influences, but we fully realise that we can't do these things, and so just hearing the idea of hours and hours of tapes being cut together. I mean, that's something we aspire to with bands like Can. The fact that they recorded in a similar way, and Faust even, of playing together the same thing endlessly and cutting parts of it out. That's something we certainly try and do as a drums, bass and guitar idea. So yeah, that does go on. Sorry, rambling answer.
Now, there are a couple of samples on the album which are quite unusual. One by Paul Lansky. Where did you find that?
Other than mixing it.
The true story behind that is that I built a drum machine, out of old components, something just generating white noise and something that was kind of opening and closing the white noise. It was sounding quite good, and I had a rhythm going, but I needed some chaos, and so I shamelessly put on some records on the turntable and tuned a radio in and just wanted to fill it up because it was far too empty. And I gave Tom a recording of this, about half an hour long, and he cut it into pieces and repeated certain sections. There's this melody in it that's really beautiful, and I couldn't remember how I made it, because I was playing a keyboard as well, and I thought, this must be something I played. It's only 4 notes, and it was only a few days later when we'd finished the song and spent days on it that I put the same record back on, and these 4 notes came out as clearly as yet. So I had to track down Paul Lansky, and the record was interesting because it was made in 1974 when he was a student, and I wasn't sure what he was doing now. Though I didn't even know if he was still a musician or anything. This was a student competition record. Who can make the best electronic music in 1974? And then I found out he's at Princeton and a professor of music. So I wrote to him and explained what I'd done. A bit embarrassed, and sent him a copy of the recording. And luckily he liked it, or liked what we'd done with his music.
And he came to the show in New York.
Yeah.
As well, and he said if you wanted to, cause he found out you hadn't finished your music studies because we'd stolen you in the rusty white van to do a tour when we started in your first term at Brooks. So he said if you wanted to continue your studies at Princeton, you get a favourable interview.
But that was great, and he sent me some of his music, so I found out more about him. And there's one track called Night Traffic that I think is wonderful. I think you've played it before on this programme.
We have, yeah. It's sort of filtered traffic noise, isn't it? That it manages to turn into music somehow.
Exactly.
An extract of Night Traffic by the American electronic composer Paul Lansky, and that was chosen by our guests tonight, Colin and Jonny Greenwood of Radiohead.
Colin, what have you done on this record other than play the bass guitar?
Oh, I've done nothing really. I haven't done anything.
No, that's the traditional bass player's posture, which you're not allowed to maintain.
Well, not really. I sort of drunkenly played other people's records over the top of what we recorded, and then said, "Oh, it should sound like that." Then, on the Pro Tools or whatever. So,
but that's exactly how we work. I mean, that's a perfect example of why it's good.
I took his Alice Coltrane record and played it over the top of a song called "Dollars and Cents," which is on the next record, and Jonny wrote this beautiful string arrangement with the St John Smith Square, this sort of Coltrane style as the backing for it. But I mean, I don't know. I sort of did before. I did more kind of arrangement things, but that was in the context of us working out stuff live in a room together, and we've kind of done less of this on this record. So it's been, I don't know, it's been quite a sort of different experience for all of us. I mean, I've sort of been trying to get into more of the electronic things and the sampling and trying to channel what I like about my favourite different types of music. But there were like 14-year-old kids who were like surfing the internet and listening, and they're starting off a list. They're Robbie Williams' Aphex Twin. So I think, what can I do?
You've brought in some interesting CDs to illustrate some of the thinking that went behind the album.
Well, if Tom was here, but one of the things that he was very into was the whole Warp Records, or aspects of Warp Records.
Oh yeah,
and,
we talked about that. Yeah.
Yeah, and sort of the different sounds. Just wanting sick of hearing the same sounds, the same things make the same noises on similar records, and just trying to find different sounds and rhythms. And for him, what was coming out of that was the most exciting, the most different, revolutionary, and forward aspect of contemporary music. So I brought a record in by someone from Rotherham whose name I don't know, but he goes under the name SND. And it's Locked Grooves, and I think it's called Travelogue. And I bought the EP when we were in Cologne, going to various mad record shops. And it's very good, sort of seductive layering of clicks and sub frequencies.
SND there with a track called Travelogue.
Now you've also brought in CD by Magnetic Fields.
Yes. One of my sort of problems with the past year or so as well is just the paucity of lyrical content in contemporary music as well. It's just, I'm a bit embarrassed because I met Stephen Merritt after his show, and I just got off the plane from Tokyo and was really jet lagged, and I had 3 pints of lager, and so I think, but I was like, so I was totally inarticulate, but I mean his words are wonderful. I mean, they're dry, they're witty, they're sad. It sounds crass, but Cole Porter meets Ian Curtis. It's that wonderful maudlin humour. My favourite is the Mama Was a Rodeo, Papa Was a Rock and Roll Band, and Love Was a Trucker's Hand, and that's a great song.
Papa was a rodeo, Mama was a rock and roll band.
Papa Was a Rodeo from Magnetic Fields CD, 69 love songs, a particular favourite of Colin and Jonny Greenwood of Radiohead, who are our guests tonight.
Do you get involved in writing any of the lyrics for Radiohead?
No, well, on previous records, we've had sort of copies of the words whilst we've been working them out live in our rehearsal room. But on this record, Tom had a long period of sort of difficulty in finding outlets for expression. So it didn't even get to the stage where we had like copies of the words to look at, because he wasn't sure about what he wanted to say with them anyway.
What role did your producer, Nigel Godrich, play in Kid A?
He played a huge part. I mean, obviously, Nigel's gift is his ability to put sounds together and create a sound curtain. That's his talent, that's what he's great at. And quickly as well, so he can put something together very quickly, and he works very closely with us. And it's a very different relationship though with this one, because with OK Computer, which we did with him in Jane Seymour's house, we rehearsed all the songs and we just went and recorded it in her beautiful old Elizabethan ballroom and stuff, and he got all the sounds up and everything. Well, with this record there was a lot more toing and froing and work in the studio. So the relationship. Did you spend
hours and hours creating the sounds and then putting them together? Is that how it worked?
We a couple of times we did that, yeah. But it was a little more fraught, really, this one, because there was sort of questioning and self-questionings of all the respective roles going on all the time.
We speak about this as if Kid A was all you were recording, but of course, at the same time that you were recording the songs on this album, you were recording the songs on the next album, which I believe you've already finished. So how do those two parallel projects work? Or maybe they weren't parallel projects.
I think we just started to enjoy being in the studio, is the short answer, and recorded far too much material for one record and wanted to release it very quickly. That's all. I mean, we considered doing a double album, but there's something that made us nervous about that. I think a lot of bands get to their third or fourth record and think their music's good enough to, hold an hour and a half of your attention, and I'm not sure it's always true. So We kind of shied away from that.
And does the stuff on the Parallel album sound like Kid A, or is it a different sound?
It does sound sort of similar because it was recorded at the same sort of time, and there are some similar sounding songs, I'm sure. I mean, the press has suggested that it's going to be a commercial pop song album.
That has been said, hasn't it?
Yeah, which has got us all kind of, biting our knuckles and, oh no, here we go again. But anyway, that's how it is.
And you're actually recording the album after that now?
We're doing yet more recording. Yeah, it's funny. It has been a long process to get to the stage where recording becomes enjoyable, regularly enjoyable, and not as stressful as it always was.
And you have your own recording studio?
Yeah, we work in Oxfordshire, quite near our homes, so it's cut off, but that's in a good way, I think.
And it's a familiar environment, presumably stuffed with also familiar technology.
Yeah, it is. Well, I mean, it's ironic because that's how we started as a band. We're basically rehearsing in village halls, and we're sort of back there again, except we're not 16 anymore.
It's probably not a village hall.
We had to go around and see Mr. Scott and ask for the key.
Yeah.
Get £1.50 off everybody.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for coming in to talk to us and playing your favourite CDs.
Thank you much.
Cool.
Mixing It was presented by Robert Sandel and Mark Russell and produced by Philip Tagney and Felix Carey.